is so exciting to see over 2,000 delegates, over 38 states represented here in New Orleans today. As all of you know, not only are we celebrating some amazing Republican presidential candidates, we're also celebrating the centennial of everyone's favorite Republican, President Ronald Wilson Reagan. I want to take a moment to remind you of what he said. He said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction." Why don't you pause for a minute and let that sink in? He said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. And it just so happens we don't pass it along in our bloodstream to our children. Every generation of Americans must fight to keep our freedoms and our liberties. And our next speaker takes that warning very seriously. I know everyone here is excited to hear from the congressman from Texas. And let's remember, for the last 10, 15 longer years, that one person has been out front. One person has been out front fighting for these liberties and standing up for this wing of the Republican Party. And our governing party, the Republican Party, consists of libertarians, and it consists of social conservatives, and it consists of conservatives who are powerful in national security issues. But this coalition doesn't work unless all three organizations work together. So please join me in recognizing Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I have great news for the cause of liberty. The country is coming our way. I've always been an optimist. I've always believed the cause of liberty would win. But even 3 or 4 years ago, I would have never predicted that we would have made as much strides as we have now today. So there's every reason for us to be encouraged and to keep the fight, because that's what America is all about. And besides, it's the law of the land, and it can be found in our Constitution, and we demand respect for it. You know, there are 4 categories that I would like to just mention in my opening remarks where we have made strides. But of those 4, probably where we have made the least amount of strides is in our civil liberties. But there's a growing interest because the American people are sick and tired of losing their privacy and being prodded by the TSA at airports and can't get on the airplane. Another area where we have made a lot more stride, and you can see it in the recent debates as well as the recent votes in the Congress, they're coming our way because the American people are sick and tired of the endless no-win wars around the world. And certainly there can be no doubt about the Republican Party and the country coming around to our views that there's too much spending, too much debt, too much borrowing, and it's time to stop the spending. How did you know that was my 4th item? I don't know how you do it. No, this is wonderful. This is where we may have made our greatest strides. For the American people to wake up and realize you can't print papers of money in secrecy by the Federal Reserve and pretend it's a creation of wealth. We have gotten the attention of the American people dealing with our monetary system and the Federal Reserve, and it's time we not only audit the Federal Reserve, but also in due time get rid of the Federal Reserve. You know, a few years ago, 1907 and 08, it was very evident there was a financial bubble, especially the housing bubble, and the bursting of the bubble was on our doorstep. The Austrian free market economists predicted it, and they anticipated, and it did arrive. This has given a lot of credibility to the views of us who look at the Federal Reserve as the culprit in creating the financial bubbles. But when the bailout came, Congress intervened, of course, and spent nearly $1 trillion bailing out the people who were making a lot of money and were bankrupt and deserved to go bankrupt and shouldn't have been bailed out. But what a lot of people didn't know about, and still a few have difficulty understanding it, there was a much bigger bailout by the Federal Reserve. They created about $5 trillion out of thin air. And then they went and they bailed out the banks and the big corporations in total secrecy. And guess what? All those bad assets, those derivatives, and all the assets that were worthless, that nobody could sell in the marketplace, guess what? We, the taxpayers, ended up buying those with money printed out of thin air to the tune of about $2 trillion. The Federal Reserve, during that period of time, and they're capable of doing it, and the reason why we have to address this subject, they can create more money and spend more money than the entire Congress. Curtailing Congress is one thing, but if the people in the Congress do not curtail the Federal Reserve, you won't touch the problem. That is why it's so important. We have had some hearings in my subcommittee on the Financial Services Committee dealing with the Fed. We have gotten more information than ever before. We do not have the audit the Fed bill passed yet, but we will. But we have found out that of all those trillions of dollars created by the Fed, guess what? 1/3 of those funds went to foreign banks. Makes no sense. And we find out that some of those funds actually went to banks partially owned by Gaddafi. Now, if that can make any sense, I don't understand it. But I think the people, once they know about this, will be outraged and are outraged at what has been going on with our monetary system. But today we are facing another crisis. The next crisis that's coming is a result of the Federal Reserve creating all this money. And that will be the inflation tax. When they create money, they inflate the currency, they devalue the currency, and prices will rise, and prices are rising. That is a tax. And that will come. It is coming. It has started, and it's going to be much worse next year. It's going to be a big issue in next year's campaign. Some of you may remember the stagflation of the 70s. It will be worse than the stagflation of the 70s because the economy is weaker now than it was, and you will see prices rising. So, for us and for the sake of America, we have to deal with this problem. I have said many times, as other candidates frequently say, we have to do something. We can't dump this on our children and our grandchildren. I address that slightly differently now because it's the current generation, it's us today that are suffering. We don't have the jobs. People are unemployed and we're getting hit with inflation. We're suffering from the overextension of the wars around the world. So it is today we are suffering from this, and therefore not only should we worry about the next generation, but we have to worry about today's generation. The most precious thing that we can do for our next generation, the debt is a concern, but the most valuable thing that we can give the next generation and allow this generation to have is to have our freedoms back. I have talked a whole lot about foreign policy for a good many years, and it is very, very important. Because it's the foreign policy originally of the Republican Party, of Robert Taft and others, of non-intervention, of that of neutrality, minding our own business, what the founders taught and what the Constitution says. Don't get involved in entangling alliances. Don't get involved in internal affairs of other nations. Don't get in the business of nation building. And besides, we don't have the money. Now, you know, if somebody's interested in looking at this in detail, one of the most significant pieces of writing that I've ever read about this subject came from Ronald Reagan. And everybody knows, you know, how he stood out in standing up to the Soviets all. But in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan put some troops, Marines, into Beirut. 241 Marines were killed, a real tragedy. And it bore heavy on Ronald Reagan. So what you want to do if you're interested is read what he said in the memoirs. What he said in the memoirs was that he said, and he used these words, he said, "I would not turn tail and run." But when he found out how irrational politics was of that reason in that region, he decided it was necessary to get out. He said, if he had followed a policy of neutrality and a policy where he was more neutral, he admitted, he said, those 241 Marines would still be alive. And I take good advice from Ronald Reagan on this because he was courageous enough to admit the mistake and say and advise us on what we should do. Robert McNamara, when he wrote his memoirs, and he was the one that built up, you know, the Vietnam War. What a tragedy. I was in the military for 5 years in the 1960s. I did not have to go to Vietnam, but I was in the service. And it was such a tragedy. Republicans won in 1968 to stop the war. 30,000 Americans died after we were elected to stop the war. The war ended, we had lost over 60,000 Americans. And McNamara was the champion of the war. More. He had second thoughts. And before he was died, he wrote a book and he was interviewed. And the interviewer said, "Mr. McNamara, would you like to apologize to the American people about what happened?" He says, "What good is an apology?" He says, "The only thing that counts is that we look at policy and change our ways." And that is what we have to do. How long are we going to allow our presidents to go to war in an improper manner? How long are we going to let our governments go to war and the Congress be derelict in their duty? We have not declared war since World War II, and we haven't won a war since World War II. I say if we have to go to war, debate the issue, declare the war, and win it and get it over with. Right now we're in Libya. Congress was not even asked or informed about it. We have a lawsuit. There's Republicans and Democrats got together filing a lawsuit and say he has broken not only the Constitution but the War Powers Resolution, which was meant to restrain the presidents from going to war like this. But our current president explained to us in a condescending way to the Congress, "Oh, this isn't a war. This isn't a war. This one doesn't qualify as being controlled by the Constitution, the Congress, or the War Powers Resolution." He said, "They're not shooting back and we haven't been killed. So evidently, if we go and bomb people and they don't shoot back, it's not a war." That's how silly the whole thing is. But it is up to us. It's up to the people. It's up to the Congress. It's up to all of us. And it's up to us to get a president that won't put up with this nonsense and won't go to war so carelessly. A lot of people will ask us as candidates, what would be the first thing you would do? And there's always a limit. You know, everybody knows what my opinion is on monetary policy, but, you know, a president can't, get rid of the Federal Reserve. He might legalize competition and allow you to use gold and silver like the Constitution says. But the president has a lot to do with foreign policy. He can change foreign policy, and he's in charge of the troops. He's in charge of the Navy. I'll bet there's not too many in this room that read a recent story this week of where our Navy just went with a cruiser, a missile cruiser, went up through the Straits of Bosphorus, up into the Black Sea, and right up on the borders of Russia. And Russia's annoyed. What would we say if China came into the Gulf of Mexico right up to the shores of us? And I know what the Texans would say, or the people in Louisiana will say, we don't need you here. But you know, one thing that I encourage people to do, especially when they question some of the things I say, that we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that, always put it in light of sort of a foreign policy golden rule. What would we think if people did that to us? What would we think? Although many reasons have been given for why people hate us and want to come here to kill us, but really the truth is they tell us the truth. They tell us why they hate us. Bin Laden told us the truth, and the truth is they cannot stand occupation and control of their land, as we would not either. Bin Laden had a plan. He was going to get us very angry, and he was going to drag us into a war. And he wrote this. He said this. He says, I'm going to drag the Americans into a war just as we dragged the Soviets into a war. And of course, we were on the side of those people who said the Soviets had no right to occupy Afghanistan. And we fought with the precursor of the Taliban to get rid of the Soviets. So Bin Laden says, I'm going to drag them into their war and bog them down in endless war. And he says, you know what? We'll drive them into a bankruptcy. This is serious stuff, because we are bankrupt and we are bogged down. We're in 5 wars. And remember, as conservatives, you have to remember what was said many years ago about war. War is the health of the state. If the state is the enemy of liberty, the bigger the government to run your life, to run the economy, the less liberty you have. So war is the health of the state, and we have endless war, and they're continuously going on. All great nations have ended not because of military confrontation. We did not have to confront the Soviets. We let them self-destruct because they spent too much and got bogged down. I would say it's time for us to give up that obligation of being bogged down in so many countries of the world. We are now in over 130 countries. We are now have military bases of over 900. We are not going to be leaving Iraq. We are not going to be leaving Afghanistan or Pakistan. We are going to expand our presence there. We're building embassies in all these countries. The embassy in Iraq is bigger than the Vatican, or is at least the size of the Vatican, cost $1 billion. And you think we're going to leave all those bases? No, we're there because we are going to argue the case, at least behind the scenes. They argue the case. We have to protect our oil. But what are our enemies doing? What are our political enemies of recent years doing? The Vietnamese, as well as China. China has become, the manufacturer of the world, selling us goods, and we borrow money. We're the greatest debtor in the history of the world, and the Chinese have $3 trillion in the bank. What are they doing? Are they going around invading countries and having their people get killed and bankrupting their country? No, they're making money. And they are buying up oil interests. They're making deals. And unfortunately, our foreign policy has driven so many countries into the hands of the Chinese. The coalition now has gotten to be India, Russia, and China, and Iran. And who's a close buddy now of Iran? Iraq. We turned Iraq over to the Shiites, and the Shiites run Iran. So our policies, no matter how well intended, and no matter what the argument may have been, have totally backfired on us. And we need to change the foreign policy. We need a pro-American foreign policy. Here at home, we are steadily losing our liberties. We're losing our economic liberties. We don't own our own property. We can't use our property unless we pay our taxes and follow all the regulations from not only the federal government, the state government, and local government, but from the UN coming down on us and telling us what we can do with our land. It's a very good reason to support my bill that would get us out of the UN and the IMF and the World Trade Organization. You know, the good intentions always get out of control. There's a good intention done by the Food and Drug Administration. Make sure your food is safe. Who's against safe food? Everybody's for safe food. But do we need the FDA? So now what the FDA is doing and why they feel so compelled to protect you, they will arrest you if you start drinking raw milk and you happen to cross a state border. What is so dangerous about you making your own choice about whether or not you can drink raw milk? I think we ought to vote for the right to drink raw milk. Now there's another good intention. The good intention that people not use drugs stupidly. And there's a lot of that goes on. But there's a lot of stupid use of prescription drugs, too, that we're not doing a very good job on. But you know, up until 1937, smoking marijuana was legal. It was still stupid. It was legal. But all of a sudden, we decided we were going to outlaw it. Well, nobody's outlawed marijuana. More people smoke it now than ever before. But some states, and I'm not familiar with this state, but some states have legalized the use of marijuana for medical reasons. You know, how compassionate, you know, how not compassionate could that be? Shouldn't people be allowed to make that choices? And as a physician, I can tell you there have been people dying with cancer. They can't hold their food down, and they're taking chemotherapy, and they get benefit. But we shouldn't be afraid of people making their own choices. But let's disregard that for a minute. But because marijuana is illegal and because the plant looks a little bit like hemp, we're not allowed to raise hemp in this country. Hemp is a very, very good product, and if you want to get high on hemp, you have to smoke a cigarette as big as a phone pole. And yet, you know, they're hysterical about it. I mean, it's irrational. But hemp is a fantastic product. It makes better alcohol. I mean, it makes better ethanol than does corn. It makes clothes. It has all kinds of product. It was very helpful in World War II. And so many of these jobs now went to Canada. Canada takes the hemp, they raise the hemp, they make these products, and they sell them back to us. And then we wonder where our jobs are going. So I would say let's legalize hemp as well. You know, because of the overburden of laws in this country, always telling us what to do economically and personally, guess what? We have more prisoners than anybody else in the world. We have 2.5 million prisoners in the world. We have 1% of our populations are in prison. And we have 5% of the population, but we have 25% of the world, of all the world prisoners. I don't think the American people are that bad. I'll tell you the truth. I really don't think we need that many prisons. My goodness. I think we have too many laws is what the problems are. Today, in the economic sphere, that is where people mostly concentrate on. We cannot separate that, of course, from the foreign policy. But 48% of the American people now, they're polled, say that they expect that next year we will very likely have a depression. Of course, those people who have been unemployed for 3 years, they already have their depression. But we have been in a slump, a severe slump, which was a predictable event. A severe slump for 10 years. Since the NASDAQ bubble burst, our population has grown by 30 million people. But we have not added any new net jobs. That's how bad it is. So we're slipping and sliding. It's always been moderated by more handouts and more entitlements to make people feel a little bit better, and it looks like we're going to be doing that for a long time, but it eventually ends up in bankruptcy. What are we going to do with all this debt? We have pretty good history to know what will happen to the debt. The debt, our debt, Greece's debt, everybody's debt, when it gets to a certain percentage where you can't work your way out of it, it gets liquidated. How does it get liquidated? Occasionally, some countries won't pay, but that doesn't happen. Usually the debt is liquidated by the government printing money, paying off the debt, and you're getting 50 cents on a dollar or 25 cents on a dollar, and that is what's happening today. We are fast liquidating our debt. But the economy, with all these trillions of dollars spent, have not picked up in these last few years. We got into the trouble because we believed that we could spend. We had the reserve currency. The world would take our money. They would take the money and we would get the goods and our debt would go up. We spent too much. We borrowed too much. We regulated too much. We printed too much. And we got into a predictable trouble. But guess what we've been doing for 3 years? We're regulating more. We're spending more. The deficit is exploding. We're borrowing more. And the Federal Reserve has unlimited amounts of money flowing into the system, and they think that's going to solve the problem. That will not solve the problem, let me tell you. We need to restore our confidence and belief in a free society and how markets work. We as conservatives are supposed to believe in the free enterprise system. That means you want to get the government out of the business of regulating us. But if we have a Federal Reserve, I have my way, they quit printing up the money because it's only helping out the rich at the expense of the poor. So I would stop that. But then you would say, well, where will the money come from? The money for investment has to come from savings. Well, will there be enough savings? Yes, if we change our tax code. We shouldn't be taxing savings. We shouldn't be taxing the elderly. They are saving money. And we should not, under current conditions today, because the Fed sets the interest rates for the benefit of the banks, they get the money for free and they make 2 or 3% and they made all their billions back. If you're elderly and retired and you get, what, 1 or 2% on your CD where the market rate is 6 or 7%. It's criminal. It's really bad. But we should not tax savings. We should not tax dividends. That's where capital comes from. But over $1 trillion worth of capital is sitting overseas because companies are global and they're able to channel the funds off. They make it overseas. They pay other taxes which are lower. All other countries, if you want to repatriate that money, they don't pay tax again. But we do. So all that money, $1 trillion sitting overseas that belongs to our companies, they won't bring it home because they're going to have to pay taxes on it. So I would say, let's quit taxing repatriated money and let them bring their capital home. But then you have to change the environment. You have to lower, the corporate tax is not a corporate tax. This idea, let's just raise the taxes on corporations. The corporate tax is a sales tax. Corporations cannot function unless they pass it on to the consumer. So that sales tax, which the corporations collect, we should stop that so they put money into investments. They need that, and then getting the taxes lowered. Corporate tax rate should be as low as possible. The regulatory burden should be lifted from their shoulders. Now, one thing I have promised. If I am to be the President of the United States, my goal My goal would be to freeze the Federal Register and then start shrinking it. No new regulations. Besides, when did we as a country capitulate and say the executive branch in the form of a bureaucracy has a right to write law? They don't. The courts don't have a right to write laws, neither should the executive branch have a right to write laws. So those laws actually should be repealed to the best of our efforts. When you allow courts to write laws, you have very, very bad legislation like Roe versus Wade that tells the states what they can do to protect human life. So I would repeal Roe versus Wade if at all possible. Let me close by talking a little bit about what a free society should be all about. A lot of people don't quite understand when I talk about people being allowed to make choices on their own lifestyle. That worries them because they might make a bad choice, which is quite possible. But what happens when government makes the choice for you? They get involved in your education. They have control of the education. The TSA tells you what your kids can do. And I want that responsibility to be put back to the parents in charge of their kids and their education. But the thing, when you are challenged on this, what you should think about is the First Amendment. We have a First Amendment, and hardly anybody argues with me or anybody else about the First Amendment. It legalized freedom of thought. You know, even communist teachers are allowed to exist in controversial things because it's political free speech. And we don't have a First Amendment so we can talk about the weather. You know, it's not that. It's to legalize freedom of speech, but nobody forever says that if you support legalizing freedom of speech, you endorse the speech that they use. You don't endorse what they say. You just endorse the principle they have a right to say it. And this is what the responsibility is like when it's on the individual. You have a responsibility to your own. It's your life. It's your life and your liberty. It comes from you, from your God, not from your government. So where is the responsibility on good behavior? It's with the individual. It's with the family. It's with the parents. It's with the church. But believe me, government's not a very good source of teaching good values. The good values have to come from us. But freedom is something that America has been well known for. And yet, in these recent decades, I would say in the last several decades, we have lost our way. We care less about freedom than we do about the government taking care of us from cradle to grave. They will protect us, it's okay to sacrifice a bit of your liberty for security, especially since 9/11. I don't buy that. I don't think you have to sacrifice any liberty for your security. The one thing wonderful about freedom as far as our country goes, it brings people together with different values, different religious and personal values, because it's non-confrontational. People aren't allowed to force anything on you, and government shouldn't force it on you as well. So freedom brings people together, and they're diverse, and that is the wonderful, magnificent part about a free society, is that it is not authoritarian. Say, you will do this and you will do this, whether it's in personal habits or whether it's economic habits. The liberals love to tell you what is fair and equal economically, but the principle is the same if somebody comes along and tells you, I don't want you to do this or that, and it would be better for your family if you didn't play cards or dance or whatever else. So a free society is, and the great part about a free society that we have forgotten about, it is the most productive society. And yet we're not productive and we're not wealthy. Which means that we are less free, and that is one of our major problems. The ideas of liberty these ideas are new. We've had the greatest experiment in the whole of history, but in 8,000 years of recorded history, we've only had a couple hundred years of really testing it. And yet, probably 95% of economic growth and well-being for the people have come with the advancement of freedom. And we in this country are about to give up on it because we have lost our convictions and understanding of how freedom works and why it depends on you as an individual. Every one of us is unique. And we don't get our rights because we belong to a group, but we get our rights because we're individuals. Individuals are the ones who claim rights, but not groups. When you live in a free society, what happens is there are restraints on the use of force, but it releases the creative energy. Because it's in a free society, you don't have tremendous growth and prosperity in a communist society. It suppresses everything. And we are being overburdened now more than ever before with big government and all the rules and regulations, so we are less productive. So the free society allows creativity. On a personal basis, it gives you the opportunity to do what is your personal responsibility. At least from my viewpoint, I think the purpose of life is to strive for virtue and excellence. That should be the goal. Now, there will be many on both ends of the spectrum that will say, well, yes, but government should do that too. But when government tries to promote virtue and excellence and make all the definitions and tell you what a fair economic distribution is, they cannot do it without undermining your liberties. So the key to it is understanding the value of the individual life and individuals, and to take that responsibility. Without the responsibility that's being assumed, it doesn't work. And of course, John Adams warned us about that. He says you have a free society, you have a republic, but if you do not assume these responsibilities, it won't work. And that's what our challenge is today. We are not quite willing to assume it, but let me say, as I started out, we are certainly moving in that direction, which makes me very happy about it. You know, Samuel Adams said that, you don't have to worry. A lot of people worry, well, how are we ever going to get a majority to agree on this? You know, you don't need a majority. You need, what he said, was an irate, tireless minority willing to start the brush fires of freedom in the minds of man. And this I can report to you is where we are making great progress. There are many, many thousands of brush fires going on in this country. I would like to think that I've contributed a little bit, but one thing I can't tell you is I cannot tell you that I know how many there are, because every place I go, I find out there is another brush fire here, and more organizations and individuals who have caught on. Now, Samuel Adams had one bit more of advice about this fight, and he was in a much tougher fight than we are today. We at least know our traditions. But he gave us one advice. He says, no long faces. They were in tough times, and they were very pessimistic, and yet he said no long faces, which meant if you come and say, oh, what are we going to do? You know, it's not going to work. But there's every reason not to have a long face. Let us enjoy ourselves, because we know what America's all about. We know what freedom can deliver for us, and we know that the momentum is with us. One way I can tell you the momentum is with us, that all of a sudden I have noticed others who happen to be running for leadership are starting to use our language. Great. Good to see everybody.